Hi, everyone. This week we will be focusing on Chapter 4, which covers diversity and cultural issues in clinical psychology. This video will be a bit shorter than other weeks because I'm also including some videos about the DSM tools that are separate from my lectures. I'm going to aim to provide an overview of the chapter in this video, and then I'll provide a second video that specifically covers cultural competence, and then I will be uploading some supplementary videos as well. So within clinical psychology, multiculturalism is currently called the fourth force. And what that means is that we've had these different historical waves within the field of clinical psychology. So just starting out, most people were practicing psychoanalysis. That was really the focus of the clinical work that people were doing. This was displaced by behaviorism in the 1950s. And then person-centered or kind of a more humanistic approach. And the current era is really focused on multiculturalism. What's different from the previous waves is that multiculturalism is not trying to displace other theoretical orientations. Instead, it's just trying to strengthen existing models and approaches. Essentially, it's just trying to take, the best of what people have been doing and try to help better support clients of varying cultural backgrounds. So a good place to start with this chapter is to discuss what is culture. So if you want, you can pause the video here, add a comment with your definition of culture. I decided to include the DSM-5 definition, actually. I think it covers a lot of different facets of culture. So the DSM defines culture as systems of knowledge, concepts, rules, and practices that are learned and transmitted across generations. Culture includes language, religion and spirituality, family structures, life cycle stages, ceremonial rituals and customs, as well as moral and legal systems. Cultures are open, dynamic systems that undergo continuous change over time. In the contemporary world, most individuals and groups are exposed to multiple cultures, which they use to fashion their own identities and make sense of experience. So there's a lot in this definition. So it covers a lot of different facets of human life. So getting down to the fundamental kind of systems of knowledge and concepts that we have, to broader things like religion and moral systems and language. But I really like how it emphasizes that cultures are dynamic and that they're continuously changing. And it also emphasizes that individual people are exposed to multiple cultures, which then kind of impacts their sense of experience. And this leads us to discuss, why culture is so important in clinical psychology. So on one hand, you could say culture is important in clinical psychology because we're a helping profession. We're working with people, with our clients. And when you're working with people, it's good to kind of understand where they're coming from, connect with them, and help support them in their goals. So that's one level, which I think you could argue for any sort of profession that involves people working with people. It's good to have a fundamental understanding of culture. But I think it goes a little bit deeper in clinical psychology because culture pervades everything that we do. So if you think back to Intro to Psychology, you might have learned about the cognitive process of top-down processing. So this is where, when we're intaking new information, we're going to draw from what we already know to make meaning of this new information. And what we know comes from our culture. So the people that we're around, the environment that we're living in, the customs that we're engaging in on a day-to-day basis, societal structures, these are all impacting our worldview, how we see the world, how we see relationships, how we understand concepts. And this is going to affect how we make meaning of different things. So culture, in a way, is going to impact how a client views their problem and views treatment and views themselves. So specifically in clinical psychology, culture is a very important factor at multiple levels. Therapists might want to explore how a client makes meaning around their psychological problem. So here are just some suggested questions that a therapist might ask their client just to better understand, what are they calling their problem? What do they think the problem does to them? What do they think the natural cause of the problem is? And I bet there's a lot of variation even within our class. So if I was to ask everyone, where do they think depression comes from? Some of you would probably say it has biological causes and that it's due to a chemical imbalance in the brain or genetics. Other people might say it has social causes, that people who feel alienated or lonely are going to develop depression. Other people might say that it has societal causes. So stressful things like poverty lead to symptoms of depression. And other people might say it's related to spiritual suffering. So an existential crisis or a punishment from God for doing something immoral. So there's a lot of different beliefs that people have about what their problem is, where it comes from, as well as how it should be treated. And some more other questions that might be good to ask around treatment are who should be involved. So a lot of times there's this assumption in individual psychotherapy with adults that it's just the client and the therapist, and then it's not really involving anyone else. But for some people, it might be really helpful to bring in family or friends or other consultants or leaders to help with discussing decision-making around treatment. So the textbook provides a few models for conceptualizing culture, and I think it does a nice job describing them, so I'm just going to touch on them here. But if you have any questions, feel free and drop them in. So first, we have the etic versus emic perspectives. And these are kind of these broad, contrasting viewpoints that a researcher or clinician might have when working with people. So an etic perspective is going to assume that all people are universally the same. And so historically in psychology, we've seen this a lot. So somebody might study, let's say, the memory process of college students in Illinois, and they're going to publish their study and say, I'm understanding how memory processes work for everybody because, we had these healthy adults in Illinois and they're just like everyone else, so we can extend the findings in that way. An emic perspective really emphasizes culture and the cultural specific norms. So someone taking an emic perspective might say, okay, I'm studying college students in Illinois, and here's some specific information about the characteristics of this group, and it does not necessarily apply to everybody. And we're really trying to understand it, how it links to culture, and only bounding it within the group that we're looking at. And so this is very broad. I think the useful application of this is to really understand where a psychologist is coming from in their work. So where are their assumptions? And it might not be solidly in one or the other. It might be that they have a combination. But really understanding, historically in psychology, we've done a lot of work that is coming from this assumption of universality. And now we have a lot more work coming in that is based on cultural specific norms. Next, we have the tripartite model of personal identity, which sort of extends this idea and says that people can and should be understood at all three levels. So in the tripartite model, we have the individual level. This is saying that every person is unique. We all have our own different genes. We have our own life experiences. We have our own different combinations of factors that make us who we are. And we are all part of different groups. So we all hold multiple identities, whether it's gender, race, ethnicity, age, geographic location. We're all part of different subcultures. And then we have universal. So all Homo sapiens have certain qualities in common. So the ability to use symbols, different biological processes, different cognitive processes. And so the tripartite model allows for all three of these things at the same time. And lastly, the textbook discusses the addressing model. So this is an acronym covering different cultural identities of the client. And this was originally developed to better understand how the client is experiencing power dynamics. So in what ways are they in a majority group versus a minority group? As part of this wave of multiculturalism, there are also a number of professional efforts that have been implemented to emphasize these issues of diversity and culture. So within the American Psychological Association, there are a number of divisions. They're kind of these like work groups that focus on different specialty areas to help promote research in certain areas. And there are a number of APA divisions that specifically focus on issues of diversity and culture. Related to this, there are a number of journals that publish cutting-edge research in this area, whether it's a journal for a specific group, such as the Asian American Journal of Psychology, or a broader journal, such as the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology. It's an effort to kind of promote research in this area and disseminate it all in one place. Some of you might be interested in accessing some of these journals for your final project if you're interested in studying a specific cultural group. So I will link some options in the rubric. There has also been an updated accreditation process for graduate programs that now require training in multiculturalism for all graduate programs that are accredited by the APA. The ethical code, which we will take a deep dive into next week, it's helpful to know that they have, ethical principles related to respecting people's rights and dignity, as well as some ethical standards related to protecting against unfair discrimination in the workplace, as well as related to how psychologists should interpret assessment results. So you might remember in chapter 2 in the textbook, the discussion of the history of how IQ tests have been utilized. And so now there are very strict guidelines on, taking into account the purpose of the assessment, as well as different testing factors, such as cultural differences, the norms of the testing, to ensure that, assessments are not being used in an inappropriate way. The DSM has also made a number of updates, which you will learn about in depth in another video posted this week, but I will touch on in this video. And then there have also been revision of different assessment methods, which I will also touch on in this video. So regarding the DSM, there have been efforts to make it more appropriate for a multicultural context. So in the DSM-5, we have the cultural concepts of distress. These were previously known as culture-bound syndromes. So you might have heard that term before, but they are now known as cultural concepts of distress. And these essentially provide a list of psychological problems observed in groups from various parts of the world. So you can use this QR code to access the table for this. I will also post it in perusal. But I'm curious to hear, what do you think about how these concepts of distress may or may not overlap with other diagnostic categories? And how do you think they should be used? Do you think there's a function for these? It's also interesting to note that in the current version of the DSM, they note that all forms of distress are locally shaped, including the DSM disorders. And so this is acknowledging that, something like depression is going to be shaped by culture, even if depression is considered a sort of universal diagnosis. So it's not considered a cultural concept of distress because we see depression across all parts of the world. But that doesn't mean it's not shaped by culture, and it's going to present differently across different groups. We also have the cultural formulation interview, and I've posted a video example of somebody using this interview. But it essentially includes specific questions aimed at guiding clinicians towards conducting a culturally informed interview. So it includes a lot of those same questions that I talked about previously in this video, at better understanding how a client is making meaning of their symptoms. Lastly, it's just helpful to know that various assessment methods have been continuously improved to be more appropriate for use in diverse samples. So both the MMPI, which you might remember is one of the more commonly used objective personality tests, and the Wechsler tests of intelligence have been revised over the years to both remove culturally biased items, as well as use a sample that is more representative of the US population. So both of these tests rely on comparing your client's scores to standardized norms that are drawn from previous testing with people. There's been a much bigger effort to make that standardized norm sample more diverse. However, it's always important that individual psychologists consider the function of testing and the context in which the results will be interpreted. Because of the history of how different assessments have been used, this is a very sensitive area, and it's an ethical imperative for the individual psychologist to consider how something like an IQ score will be used. So that's it for this video. In the next video, I will discuss current models of cultural competence.